Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and a very good evening to all of you. On behalf of the organizers, CERT events in Berhad would like to welcome the panelists and also to the participants for our join our live webinar session in positioning and repositioning Islamic finance post-COVID-19. Okay, before we start our session, I would like to spend a few moments on the housekeeping announcement. During the presentation and the discussion, all participants will be on the listening mode only. All attendees are invited to participate in the Q&A session after the discussion. Please click the raise hand button at the control panels if you'd like to ask questions. Attendees can also submit the question to the host using the chat panel in the control panel. Kindly introduce yourself first. And then if you have any general comments or need any help, feel free to chat with the host. And please fill in the evaluation e-form. Host will share the e-form at the chat panel at the end of the session. So before we start the session, let me introduce our panelists. We have brought to you the expert panelists from different backgrounds. We have from Dubai and also from New York. This session will be moderated by Mr. Syed Alwi Mohamed Sultan, the financial and banking expert, former president, CEO of Agrobank. And then the expert panelists. First is Mr. Rushdi Siddiqui, co-founder, CEO of Vaistra Tech Inc., based in US, and mentor UN SDGs, Islamic Economy, Quest Ventures, based in Singapore, live from New York. And then the second one is Dr. Mohamed Damak, Senior Director and Global Head of Islamic Finance Financial Service Research, S&P Global Ratings, live from Dubai. The third one is Dato Muhammad Redza Shah Abdul Wahid, Chairman AsSalam REITS Berhad, former CEO of Bank Muamalat Malaysia, and last but not least, Professor Dr. Engku Rabiah Adawiah from AIBIM and member SSC of Bank Negara Malaysia and Securities Commission Malaysia. So without further ado, I will pass this session to our moderator, Mr. Syed Alwi. Please proceed.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ramadan Kareem. Very good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to this session of the CERT webinar series. We are all aware that the COVID-19 pandemic is a historical episode like never seen before. More than 5 months after the initial outbreak, the unfolding of this global coronavirus crisis has severely impacted economies, international trade, social behavior, and livelihood of societies. Given the scale and scope of the COVID-19 shock, the economic consequences are predicted to surpass those of the global financial crisis of 2008. This will change the landscape of finance and banking as we know it, including Islamic finance. While Islamic finance has seen a steady and solid growth over the past 6 decades, what lessons can Islamic finance learn, unlearn, or relearn to face this crisis and remain relevant to society and its customers? On the topic of positioning and repositioning Islamic finance post-COVID-19, we have gathered 4 prominent panelists who will share their thoughts covering the broad spectrum of Islamic finance. And to get things underway, let me invite Rushdi Siddiqui to kick off this session. Over to you, Rushdi.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Okay. That's great. All right. Let me start off by, first of all, thanking CERT for allowing us this opportunity. It's 3 a.m. in New York, but it's worthwhile staying up for something as important as this. What I want to do is cover 5 topics in the 15 minutes allotted to me. In this brief 1-minute intro before I go into my presentation, a few things I want to say, which basically lays the landscape of the presentation. What we're trying to do here in the post-COVID-19 environment is expand the narrative of Islamic finance. We've talked about many times over many years what it is. Now I think we have to expand the narrative to talk about what it can do. And what it can do has to hit upon the social impact, because that is what is being impacted globally. Islamic finance is about people, right? It's about inclusion. So it's not just Muslims, it's humanity, of the unbanked and undocumented. It's about the planet. So we're talking about stakeholder as a planet and stewardship responsibilities. Third is prosperity. The United Nations has a hashtag called "No One Left Behind," and this has to be part and parcel mantra of Islamic finance going forward. And the last part is profit. Islamic finance is not a charity, it's a business. It finances business, and therefore within these realm of 4 Ps, this is what its mission should be. The OIC as a whole, 56 Muslim countries, the emerging markets have been impacted globally over the years. The COVID-19 has just exacerbated those issues. So in repositioning Islamic finance, we wanted to contribute in overcoming the crisis. So let me sort of lay that as the foundation for what I want to talk about. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the first thing is shocks accelerate innovation. In 2008 financial crisis, you saw Uber, you saw Slack, you saw a number of tech companies became unicorns. So there will be innovation coming from this particular era. But shocks also create the first victims, which are the poor. Poor are the first victims in the crisis shocks. Technology here, more than any time, can flatten the curve. And this is what Islamic finance to get behind, because what we want to do here is address the social impact of Islamic finance from what it is to what it can do. Now, first thing, a colleague of mine sent me this wonderful caricature where everyone had focused on the COVID-19, but there are bigger waves. And the biggest wave, or the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the white elephant, is climate change. And Islamic finance has to be part and parcel of this. The Islamic Development Bank has basically mandated itself to address some of the 17 goals, and they are self-explanatory here. What's interesting here, and what my colleague Mohamed will talk about, I focus on startups linked to sustainability, but the green sukuk combined with blockchain is going to have important applications in this space. The United Nations Development Program has basically embarked on, for a number of years, on Islamic finance, and now it has talking more so on the COVID-19. So what can zakat, what can sukuk, what can waqf do in this space? The United Nations Environmental Program is looking at faith-based organization in helping the transition to a more sustainable post-COVID-19 world. Again, ideal ramps for Islamic finance to get on and then showcase how its inner workings work. And then the OIC basically is involved in talking about not so much new loans, but forgiveness of existing obligations. So this, in effect, is what we're trying to address. Now, as we move forward, the biggest issue in the Muslim world is megacities. 8 of the 33 megacities are in the OIC. Megacities are defined by a population of 10 million or more. And you're talking about density, contagion. When you have that, you've got health issues. Here are the 8 megacities, and what's interesting is in all of these megacities, the countries have Islamic finance. So this lends itself to what I'll talk about as we get into this thing. The areas we want to focus in on is on water, sanitation, school, health, and food, because these are the sources of health crisis. You know, the financial crisis didn't have the same impact as this COVID-19 has had globally. So this is one of the flesh-out points, no pun intended, of this particular virus. We want to focus on the prevention over cure, because cost of vaccine takes time and it costs money. So prevention is the modus operandi over the cure, and Islamic finance, as mentioned, is in all of the 8 countries. And what I'm focusing on, and what others are focusing on, is from startups to green sukuk using blockchain, and it addresses the SDGs from the point of view of 2, 3, 6, and 11, from hunger to good health, so on and so forth. And what's going to be very interesting, going back to what I had mentioned on prevention, you're going to have artificial intelligence, IoT sensors, producing predictive analytics. So what cities will be able to do is heat map hotspots where they're able to track and trace. This data is the early signals in siren, privacy issues aside. So what Islamic finance can do with respect to these 8 mega cities where there are pending health issues is contribute in making them to smart cities. So SDG 11 is about sustainable cities, and smart city is, from my optic, another way of looking at this. Now, as we move from there, what's also impacted the Muslim world and the emerging markets and the frontier markets is food supply. The food supply chain has been disrupted because of the coronavirus. We didn't have the same impact with respect to the financial crisis in 2008. And there are a number of food insecurity issues, food malnutrition issues in the emerging markets, and they are caused by economic shocks, health shocks, extreme weather, pests. What's going on right now is this locust epidemic that is happening in parts of Africa and in the lower part of the Gulf countries, and the numbers speak for themselves in terms of damage done to an already fragile system. So this is basically a map of the food insecurity linked to the Gulf countries. You see it's a net importer of food. When you're a net importer of food, you have security issues where food security becomes a national security issues. And the Islamic Organization for Food Security is doing a wonderful job in terms of basically mapping the issues and starting to execute the lower hanging fruits to address some of these issues. So the OIC as a net importer is a net food importer, is existing malnutrition issues, food insecure, and then the carbon footprint of halal food. The GCC is not the only country with food insecurity. Malaysia is. When Vietnam and Cambodia stopped exporting rice for domestic consumption, Malaysia was hit hard. The export bans have been lifted or being phased out, but it's a reminder of food insecurity issues. And there's a food security index that I advise you all to look at. So from an Islamic finance point of view, we're focusing on food and its impact on education, its impact on other areas. So what Islamic finance and what Muslim countries have tried to do is land bank acquisition. The challenges have been number. It hasn't worked to expectation. There are startups in the food space, alternative to food loss and food waste. This is an area Islamic finance can look into. They've tried to grow food in arid conditions. The challenge was the water table became diminished, so that was stopped. And then vertical farming that you're sort of seeing in places like the UAE, the challenge is always scale. So this is the food-related issues with respect to the COVID and what Islamic finance can do. Now, as we move from food to education, this is personal to me. This is important. Reason being, you're talking about human capacity, human development for the future generation of these countries, and many of these countries are embarking on the fourth industrial revolution. If you don't have a feeder system, you cannot rely on building this fourth industrial revolution economy. These are the challenges, and I'll share the slides and the audience with the audience later through the conference organizer, but these are the challenges with respect to education. Education challenges include they remain out of school, many of the kids. What they're taught in school does not prepare them for the life skills, and they leave school before they complete their primary education. There's other stuff, but those are the highlight points. Within the Muslim world, you're looking at such a low average number of years in schooling. This is one of the biggest concerns that Islamic finance can have an impact on. So the challenges here is schools in the Muslim world, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, are not just for learning, they're for health checks. They're for food nutrition, right? In the G20 countries, COVID-19 resulted in students being able to learn online at their homes. That's not possible in the emerging markets, right? And so For Islamic finance, we're talking about SDG 4 in this decade of action where no one should be left behind. We need pilots to build smart villages, right? So you're talking about internet, you're talking about device, you're talking about power. These are small things by way of a pilot program that will contribute to this leave no one behind in this decade of action. Now, I come from the indexing space, so it was important for me to share with you the issues, how the stock market has done and how Islamic indexes have done in this past 1 year, more specifically in the last 6-7 months. This is from the S&P 500. There are 11 sectors. As you can see, there's a correlation by way of the graph, but what you see is when the variance starts to take place during the COVID-19, information technology, healthcare have outperformed, which are both sectors in Islamic portfolios, but energy has underperformed, and that's an important sector in the Islamic portfolio. Islamic finance doesn't have exposure to traditional finance, so it hasn't been hurt. Now, if we look at an Islamic sector weights, this is from the MSCI Islamic Index, we see that close to 45% of the index is from healthcare and information technology. We also see energy is 11%. So this basically tells you the exposure of the Islamic investors in a global index, and country weights are self-explanatory. Here are the top 10 constituents from the MSCI World Index, Islamic World Index, as of April 30th, 2020. You see exposure to 2 energy companies. The takeaway for me is if we're going to talk about Islamic ESG, energy companies have a low ratings or not in the ESG index. This is something that fund managers and investors have to start looking into. And from a performance point of view, this is performance from 2006 to 2019 of the MSCI World Islamic Index and World Index from MSCI. What is important here is if you look at from 2007 to 2011, the Islamic indexes outperformed the conventional indexes. What does this mean for the post-COVID-19 environment? Very interesting. There are 2 important points here that I would like the viewers on this Zoom call to download if they can. There is a study that was issued by the Bank of International Settlements called Financial Stability and Central Banks in the Age of Climate Change. It's a must-read for Islamic banks. I encourage you to look at this. And the second thing is there was a recent press release from the largest sovereign wealth fund, which is in Norway, and it blacklisted oil companies, 4 oil companies from Canada, because they want to mitigate risk. Investing is about mitigating risk, and oil companies are a risk going forward. So Islamic indexes have market performed, and going forward, if we look at numbers from 2007 to 2011, there is some positive developments on the horizon. Now, as we move from there, what's also important in this space is remittances to the emerging markets. COVID-19 has basically caused furloughs, has caused people to lose jobs, so on and so forth. So the amount of remittances have been reduced to many of the emerging markets, including the Muslim countries. And remittances go obviously from north, north, south, south, north, south, so on and so forth. It's self-explanatory. Now, what's interesting is, according to the UN numbers, the 800 million people that are recipient of remittances, and in 2020, it's been estimated by the World Bank, it'll be slashed by 20% to 454 billion. The remittances are used for education, for healthcare and food. So you will see an impact on these particular areas in the emerging markets and in the Muslim countries. Now, government has these stimulus programs, but how do you get money to the unbanked and the undocumented in a timely basis? This is where the role of mobile wallets comes into play. Here you're talking about financial inclusion and the multiplier commerce impact, and Kenya's M-Pesa is a great example. This is 122 fintech companies, and it's from our colleagues from IFN. What you'll see here is a lot of these are pre-A, generally speaking, in the seed area, and there's a bias towards crowdfunding, P2P, and what's interesting is now in the area of payments and remittances. So what's happening now here, slowly is Islamic finance can slowly address SDG 1, which is poverty, SDG 2, which is hunger, 3 is education. 3 is good health, 4 is education, so on and so forth. By investing in local fintechs, which can basically address the local pain points. You've got accelerators like the United Nations Development Program Accelerator Lab, and they are working in a number of Muslim countries. Islamic banks can work with them. Quest Ventures, where I'm a mentor, we just finished on a $50 million first close of a fund. Some of the investors were family offices, plus sovereign wealth funds from Singapore and Kazakhstan. We'll be launching an impact fund, and this impact fund will have exposure to Islamic finance startups. Conclusion, 2008 was a missed opportunity for Islamic finance to show its alternative side, and the data from MSCI shows that there is an upside. We need to talk about what Islamic finance can do, and we're talking about innovation. One of the important innovations, at least from my optic, has been green bonds. And these are linked to environmental projects. In 2019, $257 billion were issued. This year, it's estimated to $350 billion. We have green sukuk, and Malaysia was one of the first pioneers in line with its leadership in Islamic finance by issuing the first green SRI sukuk in 2017. It has issued 5 to my knowledge. Indonesia issued a sovereign green sukuk of $1.25 billion. So going back to social impact by innovation, a green sukuk starts this journey. What I had mentioned earlier about pilots. Pilots become extremely, extremely important for Islamic finance to test itself beyond murabaha, right, beyond the fixed income side, to look at disrupting problems. And it can, because an important part of disruption is money, whether it's conventional money or compliant money. And the sectors it has to look at are the sectors that are in the most need in the emerging markets, which is all the Muslim countries. And as a conclusion, the major areas of contribution for Islamic finance, financial stability, financial inclusion, shared prosperity, and these are aligned to the SDGs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rushdi. Can I now invite Dr. Mohamed Damak to share your views?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes, got it.
Okay, excellent. First of all, very good morning and very good afternoon to all of you. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation, and if I can please ask them to put on my slides. So basically in my presentation, I'll start by talking about the impact of the current environment on the Islamic finance industry, and then probably talk a little bit on how Islamic finance could make a difference. And as you can see, I think virus, oil, and the volatility that we have observed in the stock market and in the global capital market, not just the stock market, can be seen as the perfect charm because they are impacting the industry from multiple angles. And if you go to the next slide, please, I'm sure that you probably heard the word unprecedented, an unprecedented number of times in the last couple of months. But if you look at the economic contraction for the core Islamic finance countries, I think 2020 will be an unprecedented year from that perspective. We expect, for example, for the GCC, a contraction by more than 4%. We expect a contraction by more than 2.5% for Turkey. For Malaysia as well, we think that the growth will be negative this year. Indonesia is the only country that will be growing at a much slower pace compared with what we have observed in the last few years. And that has already started to impact the global sukuk market, because if you look at the performance in the first quarter of 2020 and compared to the first quarter of 2019, the volume of issuance has already dropped by more than 30%. And we expect, if you go to the next slide, please, we expect the slowdown to continue. In terms of overall expectation, we think that the volume of issuance would reach around $100 billion in 2020, compared with $162 billion in 2019. And the drop will be across all the different cluster of issuance, whether it's foreign currency, whether it's local currency. Although in the first quarter of 2020, we have observed few of the issuers front-loading some of their issuance in order to benefit from the from what was at that time extremely supportive market conditions. Remember, we had a lot of liquidity hitting the market. We were expecting the issuers that have good credit story to have a fairly easy access to the market in 2020. But then the whole picture has changed when the coronavirus outbreak started and when the measures of social distanciation, lockdowns, etc., started to have an impact on the economies of core market. So I mentioned that we expect the volume of issuance to drop by almost 40%. The reason why we expect that, if you go to the next slide, please, is that number one, next slide, please. Number one, the core Islamic finance countries' central banks have opened the liquidity taps locally and asked their banks to lend to the corporate in order to meet their growing cash flow needs. Imagine a corporate that is not operational, that still have to pay the rent, have to pay the salaries. So there is an additional cash flow needs, while at the same time the revenues are not coming. So what we have observed in most of the core markets in Islamic finance is that the central banks have been putting in place liquidity lines for the banks to use them to provide some subsidized loans to their corporate clients. In the UAE, for example, we've seen the Central Bank of the UAE putting in place a liquidity line of 50 billion dirhams, which is equivalent to almost $13 billion for the local banking system to extend subsidized lending to the local corporate sector. The second reason why we think the volume of issuance will drop is, if you recall who has been issuing sukuk for the past few years, you can see that central banks have been playing a tremendous role. Like in 2019, for example, central banks have accounted for almost 18% of the total volume of issuance. And this year in 2020, these central banks will be providing liquidity rather than taking liquidity from the market. So we don't expect them to issue sukuk in 2020, and that will also weigh on the market performance. The third reason is the change in investor sentiment. I think it's fair to say that risk aversion has increased quite dramatically over the past few months, and we've seen capital exiting from some of the core Islamic finance market at an unprecedented pace. If you look, for example, at what happened in Turkey or in Indonesia or even in Malaysia, you would see that the capital outflows that the countries have experienced since the beginning of the year are way too much higher with the numbers that we have observed in 2019. The good news there is that more recently we started to observe a change in investor sentiment and a little bit of reversal that is explained by the strong global liquidity chasing very limited assets and the search for yield by investors. And finally, the reason why we think that sukuk volume of issuance will drop in 2020, it's simply because sukuk are still complex instrument, or more complex instrument to issue than conventional bonds. In this challenging times, we've seen the government and the GCC, for example, tapping the conventional bond market and not tapping the sukuk market, and that's because we're still in a situation where the issuance of sukuk takes more time, costs slightly more sometimes than a conventional bond, and takes much more effort to put together and to hit the market. So except for countries like Malaysia, where we understand that the process is much smoother, for the GCC, I think most of the issuance in 2020 will happen either in tap form, meaning that the issuer would use an already existing structure and increase the amount of issuance, or would happen under existing programs. But I certainly don't see a lot of issuance coming from primary issuers or establishment of new programs. If you move to the next slide, please. So the panel question is how to position or reposition Islamic finance in this environment. And I think the answer to this question is pretty simple. If you move to the next slide, you can see that here we try to do an exercise of comparing the 5 maqasid al-Sharia, or the ultimate goal of Sharia, with all the issues that have to do with environmental, social, and governance indicators that are becoming more and more important in investor decision-making these days. And there, I think the two low-hanging fruits were the environment. I think Rushdi talked about the green sukuk issuance. We've seen it happening in Malaysia. We've seen it happening with the sovereign in Indonesia, with Majid Al Futtaim here in the UAE, and we think that the opportunities there are quite tremendous, especially if you look at the objective of some of the GCC countries in terms of energy mix and the contribution of renewable energy to the energy mix by 2030 and 2050. So the opportunity is no longer to demonstrate when it comes to green sukuk. On the governance side, I think again, Islamic finance is subject to an additional layer of governance versus the conventional finance. And the question there is, would this governance layer work properly and encourage the market discipline you would expect? But these, I think, in this environment, these are probably taking a backseat compared with the social aspect of Islamic finance. And there, I think where Islamic finance could make a difference is by leveraging its existing social instruments in order to help the world go through the current turbulent environment. And I see 4 products that could be eventually used in the current crisis in order to achieve that objective. The first one is Qard Hasan. I think you all know that Qard Hasan is an instrument that provides funds to clients without charging any profit. And Qard Hasan here can provide a breathing space for the retail and the corporate customers until the environment stabilizes. And again, if you look at what the central banks are doing, they are doing that already. I talked about the Central Bank of the UAE and the 50 billion dirham facility that they put in place. It's a 0% interest rate facility. So it's if you look at it from an Islamic finance lens, it's a Qard Hasan that was provided to the banking system in order to help them to extend lending to their end users in order to preserve the productive capacity of the UAE economy. The second instrument is social sukuk. Again, we've seen it happening. I think Khazana National Berhad used social sukuk a few times between 2015 and 2017. And the interesting fact about social sukuk is that the periodic distribution rate would be a function of achieving a certain number of key performance indicators that could be related, for example, to job preservation in the current environment. And also, I think the social sukuk could help not only talk to the Islamic investors, but also attract the investors that are interested in the ESG aspect of the transaction. Other than these 2 specific instruments, there are a few other instruments that exist in the Islamic economy, in the broader Islamic economy, and not just Islamic finance. And these are the waqf and zakat. And I think Waqf can be leveraged in order to provide, for example, affordable housing solution or affordable healthcare or education to people that might have lost a portion of their income, or to people that have been negatively impacted by the current COVID-19 crisis. But for Waqf, I think it's important to remember that the use of Waqf money requires a specific or proper governance framework that would make sure that the Waqf funds are not diverted from their original social purposes. And I think there the Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institution came with a draft few quarters ago, but I'm not sure if the final standard has been approved or not. And the final instrument that exists in the zakat in the Islamic economy is the zakat, and which can definitely be used in this environment in order to help people that might have lost a portion of their income. And here again, it's without any expectation of remuneration and repayment. And by doing that, I think Islamic finance could show to the world that it really contributes to no leaving anyone behind, and it really contributes to the shared prosperity in the world. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohamed. So we have heard from Rushdi, who is speaking to us from New York. And we have also heard from Dr. Mohamed, who is speaking to us from Dubai. And we have two more speakers to go. I would like to invite Dato Redza to share his views. Over to you, Dato.
Okay, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Wabishrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Salam Ramadan to all. We're in the 26th day of Ramadan. I wish you all a good health. And thank you, CERT, for organizing this webinar. Also an indication that they themselves are repositioning their events to web-based, an indication of how all these things are making changes to our lives. Hello to my colleagues, Syed, Alwi, former Agrobank and former colleague in Bank Muamalat, Rushdi from Vaistra, very interesting proposition that he gave on looking at the food sector, the education and healthcare. Dato Dr. Mohamed Damak, and I'll probably expand a little bit on what he talks about, the 4 pillars of Islamic finance that is looking upon to help Islamic finance. And also the much respected Professor Dr. Engku Rabiah, who will be speaking later. I'm going to speak in the context of Malaysia and in the context of what's happening in the banking world in Malaysia. So, but it gives a flavor as to what is happening or can happen in the other parts of the world. First of all, what has this COVID-19 really taught us? And in one word, I would say that it has taught us to actually get off our backs and change. And this is the new norm. We need to change. I give you an indication. Just yesterday, after all this MCO in Malaysia, I went to a bookshop in Taman Tun, and lo and behold, I walked into this bookshop, and what do I see? This guy is selling fruits. And it shocked me, and I asked him, I said, why are you selling fruits? What about your books? And he said, oh, my books are over on the other side, but you know, market has changed, and with all these things happening, I also have to change things. And this is exactly what we're going to see. And if you don't change quickly, a lot of things are going to be irrelevant moving forward. And I remember a Robin Sharma poster in our bank in the lifts. He says, change is hardest in the beginning, messy in the middle, and beautiful in the end. We are actually going through this hardest and probably messy part of the crisis. So I believe if we hang in there, we will weather the storm. Having retired from banking, and I actually timed myself quite well, I've also had the privilege to listen and advise some of my Islamic finance leader friends on this COVID matter. When we look at Malaysia, there were positivities and negativities that we went through in the banking sector. And a large part of what we were looking at was this government assistance that came in the form of a 250 billion package. Now, when we diced this package, we realized that 170 billion of this package is actually coming from the banking sector. And this was on the moratorium on the loan and financing. So the banking sector, and part of it was the Islamic banking sector, played a huge role in helping the economy get back to its feet. But let's look at the positivities of this moratorium thing that happened. I think the positivity of what happened was that being a dual banking system, we had Islamic banks and conventional banks. It was something automatic that there was no talk about compounding interest, because the conventional banks had to follow the Islamic banks in terms of compounding interest. So actually in this matter, Islamic finance had actually led the other conventional sector by saying that our rule says we don't compound interest, or we don't compound profits. So you actually have to follow. And that's exactly what happened through that. But that was the positive side. When then we looked at the negative side, the whole thing came out regarding issues surrounding fixed rate financing and akad, whereby Islamic banks had to go back to their customers to get consent for extended financing. So that move, plus there were uncertainties over charges during the moratorium period, had consumers criticizing about Islamic finance. And this was something that was quite difficult, and eventually it was solved when the minister came out and said that, you know, we're going to waive the compounding interest or compounding profit. There was no charge during the 6 months that was happening. So actually, it brought about the issue on law and order. The High Purchase Act also came into being, and imagine this mess of going back to the customers and having customer agree on this financing. Perhaps later on, Professor Rabiah, being Bank Negara SEC, could throw some light into this matter. If you ask my opinion, we have to basically reposition Islamic finance fixed rate contracts and look at, see how we can do this. Now, as to how Islamic finance in Malaysia has weathered the crisis, I can say that the capital ratios are very strong here. So, you know, most of the Islamic banks had capital ratios in excess of 13%. And really all the stress testing and strong capital ratios that was imposed on us finally was put to test this time around. And I must say that, you know, we come out stronger through all this. But my main concern is, as we are going through this, and Rushdi mentioned something about it, is that the issue of the unbanked people. The issue of the unbanked people is going to be increased. So how do we overcome this issue? And Islamic banks must work extra hard to look at that. Some of my suggestions in relation to this is we should look at Aranu, and when the first phase of the MCO happened, was finished, people were running to pawn shops and pawning their gold because they didn't have money. But they didn't go to Islamic banks to do that. And this is an aspect that Islamic banks need to look at. They need to loosen up a lot of the regulations surrounding consumers, and so that people come and are free to go to a bank rather than a non-halal pawn shop. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch upon is acceleration in bringing IT solutions and Again, Brother Rushdi mentioned about the mobile wallet. And here I laud some of the Islamic banks like Bank Muamalat and Bank Islam, which quickly brought zakat payment solutions to the market. So people didn't need to go out, and they could do their zakat payments via online banking. And moving forward, this is a good thing. One bank in particular, I think Bank Muamalat, they did a bazaar platform to allow smallholders to get involved in this new environment of selling online. What was mentioned by Professor Damak, zakat is another powerful instrument, and it should be used to reach out to the needy. Somehow most Islamic banks choose to pay their zakat to zakat authorities and have only CSR funds to assist the public. In my previous shop, we used to hold a portion of the zakat for us to distribute to the public. Now this is more effective and more efficient, and banks should consider expanding or actually looking into the social responsibility aspect of playing a role, especially in terms of using zakat as an instrument to assist the public. Another thing that was mentioned by Professor Damak is on sukuk. Now, as we saw in 2018, Indonesia teamed up with UNDP for 1.25 billion sukuk. So although the 6 months moratorium given may be time for Islamic banks to consider more flexibility and time for customers, this sukuk thing is something that social sukuk is something that we will need to look at and look forward. Now, surrounding all these things, despite the fact that Islamic finance wants to do a lot of good, the problem lies in accounting issues and also the issues pertaining to law. Here we had the issue of what we call the modification loss. The modification loss occurred because when you don't account for 6 months of income, you had to revalue your property, your portfolio, and that caused a lot of modification loss, or will cause a lot of modification loss to a lot of the Islamic banks that is happening. So also I want to touch a little bit about helping what was mentioned also on Qadrul Hasan. I think Islamic banks should come out and do Qadrul Hasan type financing. Now, I don't propose it to be done in the Islamic banking system or in the Islamic banks itself. What they should do is have a yayasan or a sadaqah house like in Bank Islam, and use this, put a couple of million into these funds and give Qadrul Hasan financing to the small petty traders. These are the people who are suffering at the moment. They need help, and you know, 1,000 or 2,000 ringgit will make a lot more difference on that. In conclusion, I just want to say that what worries me is there will be more customers and companies who are in bad financial track record. Banks needs to be looking at things in a different context and not look at the existing matrix on financing approvals for them to look at financing. Maybe relax a little bit more on the CPRIS and CTOS financing, and we will see, if this doesn't happen, we will see more and more people reliant on the grey and black markets, and riba will thrive even more. So we are responsible here to actually try and get customers back into the banking market, despite knowing that things are not tough, things are getting tough, because the real alternative that exists now is the riba market for them. So I do hope we work together to get them back on track. Thank you.
Thank you, Dato Redza. I would like to now invite Professor Dr. Engku Rabiah to share her views and presentation. Go ahead, Prof.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, the organizer and also moderator and the rest of the panelists for having discussion on this topic with very interesting ideas. And I do found that some of the things that I wanted to share has actually been discussed by some of the prior panelists. But I think so. I would like to share some of my points here. And based on what has been mentioned earlier, we have seen how the original health crisis resulting from COVID-19 had then snowballed into economic crisis. I think the very poignant picture shown by Rushdi earlier on, the three waves. The first wave, the small one, is the health crisis, the COVID-19, and then the recession, economic crisis. And the third, the biggest wave would be the climate crisis. So we have to see how that will actually manifest itself. But in my slides, I'm going to trying to discuss about this very popular quotation that we should never let the crisis go to waste. Because in every crisis, like people always say, there's always a silver lining. So the crisis normally happens due to a flaw in the way we do things. And the crisis comes to remind us that we need to change the way we do things so that the crisis will not continue, and so that we can actually opt for a better way of doing things. So lessons that we can see from the COVID-19 and then the subsequent economic crisis that follows. So these are actually things that we need to use as an opportunity for us to change to the better, rather than letting the crisis go to waste and not take lessons from it. So basically, I'm going to look at this four main themes, like what are the issues, what are the lessons learned, what would be the focus areas, and what would be the strategic positioning that we are trying to set for Islamic finance moving forward, so that we will not let this crisis go to waste. I think Rushdi has alluded to the fact that the 2008 crisis have not been fully taken advantage of by Islamic finance, where they did not really make the necessary changes. So now we are coming to another crisis, and let's not this crisis go to waste as well. Okay, so basically, when we look at the crisis, I think the main issues here, we can see that as a result of the COVID-19 and the resulting movement control order, it has halted a lot of businesses, a lot of economic activities, and this resulted in the snowballing of the economic issues. And be of two levels. First, at the public, the people level, where they can feel the pinch of the crisis, how the economic has been becoming more restricted to them. And at the next level, we have also seen the government facing also we have seen generally governments are losing money, or at least they have reduced income, especially like Malaysia, for example. The Prime Minister said for every day of the movement control order, we are losing 2.4 billion ringgit. That is every day, and we had almost like 2 months of MCO, movement control order. So we can imagine the amount of losses that the government is or has faced. But at the same time, because of the need to subsidize and put in stimulus packages for the public, the government is now having to have a higher budgetary requirement. So then we can see the most immediate problem or crisis that the government will face, whether it can be lowered, but at the same time the budget finance to overcome this fiscal deficit, or at least bridge the gap in their fiscal deficit. And at the people's level, we see that although the COVID-19 storm affect everyone, but not everyone are in the same boat, like people are saying. So some people are perhaps less affected because they are in a big cruise, they are in the yacht, they can weather the storm well. But some people are without boats, Some are very small, dingy, or some are in boats with holes in it. So they are less able to weather the storm. So because of that, we have seen data produced in some of the research. For example, I'm referring to the Khazanah research, where they have highlighted that the most or the worst impacted by the COVID-19 would be the non-salaried people, where they are either self-employed or they are basically paying for their own business. So when the movement control is in place, business is halted except for a few essential services. So in general, most of the self-employed lose their job, or they will be having or they are experiencing reduced income. And the same also happening to the small and medium enterprises. Depending on the nature of their business, most business become out of demand. So we have seen like hospitality businesses, travel, tourism. So these are all involving a lot of supply chain in between, which involves SMEs. So they're losing business due to the change in demand and supply. People are no longer demanding these services. They are demanding other types of services. Okay, so business are being lost. To some extent, we have seen even the salaried people, those are being employed, have also a higher propensity to be made redundant due to the crisis, and there will be a rush in unemployment. So the issue is how to create employment to all these categories. And to make the crisis, they are also, a majority of them do not have savings. Like the data in Malaysia says that like 60% of them have savings less that can make them survive in less than 1 month. So they don't even have money enough to make them survive in a month's time. So these are very severe crises, either at the people level or at the government level. So when we look at this, the lessons that can be learned is basically that everything is taken care of. But the crisis shows that there are a lot of vulnerabilities. Although there are stimulus, there are aid initiatives by the government and whatnot, but these stimulus and aid initiatives are not able to reach out to all people. So a number of the panelists have been mentioning about nobody should be left out. And unfortunately, we see that there are still people being left out. There are still gaps. Those who are self-employed, sometimes they are not even in the radar of the bank, not even in the radar of the financial industry. Some of these self-employed, especially the very small traders, they don't even have bank accounts to begin with. And if we look at Malaysia, for example, we have a lot of illegal immigrants, and even some refugees. They don't have legal identities, so they are people who are being left out in the system. So what would be the response by Islamic finance? And I think the expectation is basically we want to see the Islamic finance coming and trying to bridge the gap and providing solutions so that more of the people who are being left out can actually be included. So when we look at the answer, basically in terms of the strategic positioning that can be played by Islamic finance, as we can see that Islamic finance has various sectors. We have banking, takaful, suku, and funds and whatnot. So a lot of things can be mentioned here. I think Dr. Damak has been mentioning about the role of sukuk, and he was mentioning the view that there would be a reverse in terms of the demand, and perhaps there will be a reduced amount of sukuk being issued. But I think there's still opportunity, what I was mentioning earlier on, that the government will be facing fiscal deficit, and I think sukuk is one of the avenues for the government to have a sovereign issuance in order to bridge the fiscal deficit. And in this regard, I would think the sustainable responsible investment, or SRI sukuk, can play a very strong role, where we can have something like a social impact sukuk, where the investment can be stacked So the actual impact that money is having on the targeted interventions. Okay, like for example, we are looking at things that we are facing now. Somebody mentioned about education earlier, how in the emerging countries, the schools and the students in emerging countries cannot afford to have access to education just because they don't have internet access. Okay, so if we can have SRI or social impact sukuk being developed to provide internet access to everyone in the country, and the success of the sukuk would be dependent on the actual success of the internet access being available to the country, especially to the students, so that learning will not be impacted, even though face-to-face sessions cannot be held. Okay, so other avenue can be things like retail sukuk or perpetual sukuk. So these are potential areas for development where sukuk can actually strategically position in order to attract unique categories of investors, including philanthropists, wakaf investors, and even to some extent zakat money in order to invest in the form of qard hasan or direct payment to the real needy in order to bring them out from hunger and poverty that they are facing as a result of the crisis. Of course, in addition to that, I think somebody was mentioning about SRI or social impact funds, some social finance in the form of wakaf and zakat and whatnot. So I don't want to touch too much detail on that. I will actually just move on to something which is closer to me in Malaysia, where we have the low-hanging fruit of the VBI initiative by the central bank, the value-based intimidation initiative by the central bank, which has already been introduced since 2017 in Malaysia, but for some reason, partially maybe contributed by the change of leadership at the central bank, we see that these value-based intimidation initiatives sort of being shelved a little bit. So because of that, I think the positioning that the banking sector, Islamic banks can actually leverage on would be to further revive and to actually re-intensify the initiative under the value-based intimidation in order to make Islamic finance better positioned to address the crisis that has been brought about due to the COVID-19. So basically, when we look at the value-based intimidation, just to recap, because it has been shelved for more than a year already. So just to recap, when we talk about value-based intimidation, we're looking at a paradigm shift or a behavioral change in the Islamic finance. So basically, we are talking about not just the profit dimension, but we are looking at ethical and responsible behavior dimension as well. So what has happened during the COVID-19 is actually a very apt example. Okay, I think that Dato Redza mentioning about how one of the initiatives made by the government was to actually have a 6-month moratorium announced for most of the financing given by the banks, including Islamic banks. So under the moratorium, basically the hire purchase, the personal financing, home financing, Islamic banking customers do not have to pay for these installments during the 6-month period in order to give them a breathing space during the difficult economic situation that they may be facing. But then, as already also pointed out by Dato Redza, due to the law and also the application of some of the accounting standards, in particular IFRS 9, we have seen that it has resulted in Islamic Bank having to face modification losses. Okay, and these modification losses have to be recognized in the current year. And because of that, we have seen in the news that some Islamic Bank announced that they may be losing 4.4 billion ringgit just because of the 6-month moratorium. So now we are, if you were to put the VDI values here, is the bank just looking at their profit dimension, or are they also looking at the ethical and responsible behavior dimension? So basically, if we are looking at Islamic finance as finance for good, then we have to take this into consideration. So as a result of which, if I want to refer to some of the discussions that we have at the Sharia Advisory Council of the Central Bank, we have basically, when we discuss on this issue, we put a lot of focus on the actual circumstances of the customers. If the customers are really in financial distress, then we must give extension without having any additional charge, because it's not just about the profit to the bank, but we have to be responsible in the way we treat our customers. If the customers are in genuine hardship, we cannot charge them for the extension. Okay? But of course, if the customers are not really in genuine hardship, it's more of temporary cash flow hiccups, then we are saying that that is up to the bank and the customer to renegotiate in order to mitigate the harm caused to both parties. There may be hardship faced by the customer, but the bank is also facing some kind of hardship. So this hardship will be shared, and they can renegotiate on a different pricing mutually between themselves. But the new pricing cannot be just arbitrarily imposed on the customer. All changes in the pricing must be mutually agreed between the bank and the customer. Okay. So this is to reflect that it is not just about preserving the profit to the behavior dimension. That's why value-based intimidation to be further embraced and re-emphasized by the Islamic Bank, so that it will not just be an initiative that is there but not be acted upon by the Islamic Bank. So when you look at the focus areas of the value-based intimidation, it's about bringing positive and sustainable impact on the 3 Ps, to the economy, to the community, and to the environment. And in order to do this, basically, Islamic Bank has to come out with innovative products. They have to be efficient in their provision of the services, and they have to have an enabling and effective ecosystem. And to do that, basically, we can see that Islamic Bank has to change their hat from the capitalist hat to perhaps socially responsible capitalist. Okay, not just capitalist, but socially responsible capitalist. We are talking about shared prosperity, or not just about profit maximization. We're looking at more sustainable way of providing financial services based on the maqasid al-Sharia. So when we look at the main underpinning thrust of value-based intimidation, we are looking at empowering the community. We're looking at enforcing and reinforcing and also encouraging and strengthening the entrepreneurial mindset among the customers. So this would require the Islamic banks to move beyond the simple products of personal financing or just hire purchase or home financing. We have to move towards more trade finance, more community empowerment kind of things. I think Rushdi was mentioning about water, food security, agriculture. So these are the things which in the past has not been in the forefront. But I think moving forward, Islamic banks have to pay serious attention to these areas as their core business, as their core focus in actually ensuring that money or liquidity that they have is used for the optimal benefit of the society and community at large. And at the same time, preserving the environmental soundness of the universe. So before we already have the value-based intimidation plan with all its strategies. Everything has been clearly laid out. So what is needed is just to revive and intensify its implementation. we need to walk the talk. We have to have concrete plans and strategies. And in Malaysia, we had already 9 Islamic financial institutions agreeing to be the Council of Practitioners for BBI, to champion BBI. This includes Bank Muamalat, Bank Islam, AIBIM, Bank, Agrobank, and whatnot. So it is now time for us to move and do it, rather than just saying that we're going to do it, but we don't do it. So, so with that, I would be confident that if we are able to actually implement BBI in its true sense, then we will be in a better position to reposition or to strategically reposition Islamic finance such that the industry will be having more innovation, better reach, more efficient, better ecosystem, and this will allow for the consumer or the community to have improved services in a fair and transparent manner, which is realigned with the government and national agenda about having shared prosperity. I know if for those of you who do not know, in Malaysia we have the shared prosperity vision. By 2030, we want to have a shared prosperity nation. So hopefully this can be achieved partly by Islamic banks being fully into the VBI and fully implementing VBI. And with this better and clearer value propositions, we will be able to have better and sustainable policies and actions which would have positive impact on the economy, community, and environment. So I think I will stop there for the moment. So I will give back the session to the moderator. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Engku. We have another 15 minutes to go. I will open the session for questions and answers from the audience. Let's look at, you can either type your questions. I'm looking at the chat box. There are not that many questions. I think everyone has been very attentive to the presentation. Do we have another format of asking questions? Afika, can the audience...
we can open for oral questions as well, right?
Audio-based questions.
Yes.
You can raise your hand and ask questions to any of the speakers. We will open the session for questions and answers. While waiting for the audience to pose questions, let me just quickly...
There's a question in the chat. There's a question in the chat box.
Chat. I think there's one point from Dr. Samsia Abdul Karim. It's more of an opinion, I believe. Yeah. So thank you for that feedback. It is true that Islamic banks, what distinguishes Islamic banks against conventional banks is how Islamic banks play their social and moral obligation or responsibilities during difficult periods. I think that's the point, and that's to live up with Maqasid Sharia. So thank you for that point. And I think all speakers have very much pivoted to a central theme, that Islamic finance is more than banking, more than just giving out loans, more than just raising funds through a bond or sukuk, or even into certain underlying assets. Islamic finance has a moral and social obligation to support the economy, especially the lower levels of the economy, the bottom segments of society, and Islamic finance can do more. But what has hampered Islamic finance all this while is, in my view, and I would like to even pose this to any of the panelists, is that Islamic banks have pivoted to providing credit or financing, simply because they have been molded by regulatory requirements, whereby regulators have a mandate and responsibility to ensure that the financial system is sustainable, resilient, and is not subject to too much of risk-taking enterprises by the financial players. As a result of that, Islamic banks have pivoted towards credit risk models that are amenable to their board and amenable to regulators. And at the same time, they are also answerable to their shareholders, and they have a profit maximization objective as well. How then, the big question, how then do Islamic banks play that balancing role between achieving profits while at the same time playing their social and moral obligation to help society and socioeconomic objectives? So that's one point that I like to just pose. The other point that I think we can make is Islamic finance from the beginning in academic field has always been on the basis of equity-based structures. Mudaraba, Musharaka, Wakalah. Well, Wakalah is no agency, but Mudaraba and Musharaka structures have always been central to any thought leadership in Islamic finance. But over the years, Islamic finance has become more debt-based, be it banking or even sukuk market, have pivoted towards more debt-based. Is this pandemic, is this crisis, as Professor Engku mentioned, let's not make a crisis go to waste. Is this the time that Islamic finance should reposition itself, go back to its central theme of equity-based finance, equity-based tools and solutions? And how do they do that within strict regulatory requirements? Is it within banks, or is it within other financial structures? These are challenges that Islamic finance will have to face as they pivot and as they reposition themselves in the aftermath of this pandemic. So let's, with that point, let's look at, I think there are some questions that has been coming through. There's one question here. In your opinion, what type of investors should Islamic finance target in the current tightening environment to raise funds to support areas highlighted by the panelists, education, healthcare? So I think this is a question that Rushdi would be right to take up. Question is, what type of investors should Islamic finance target? Go ahead, Rushdi. Are you still?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I think if you look at family offices, you look at foundations, you look at impact investment entities, those entities have a different risk profile. And their risk profile isn't just confined to a certain developed country geography. They're looking at emerging markets. If future crises are going to come as a result of density in cities because of water, sanitation, and other areas that I have mentioned, it is these types of investors that are ready, willing, and able to look at investing. But the key issue here is the use of blockchain. One of the challenges in impact investing is being able to follow the money, that is deployed accordingly, and that the results are ascertained in a short period of time instead of 12 months when the books are published. So there are institutions out there that are interested in the impact space, and they're doing something. Islamic banks per se don't have to, but you've got Islamic asset management, and you've got money set aside in discretionary funds that have to look into and invest in what is globally trending to be relevant. Otherwise, we just keep talking about Islamic finance and what it is, and not talk about what it can do.
Okay. I think question for Dr. Mohamed. It's interesting that you said in your presentation that you don't think that sukuk issuances will be as high as last year's issuance. But there are also views that as a result of this economic crisis, there will be heightened debt levels amongst all segments of the economy, corporates, governments, and even households. And developing countries will be hampered by sluggish economic activity, which may affect their ratings. Can I have your views on this?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thanks for the question. I think in terms of volume of issuance, yes, I mentioned that the volume of issuance of Sukuk will drop this year, but on the contrary, for the conventional issuance, and I think we started to see that happening, I think a lot of the countries in the GCC, for example, will naturally go to the conventional market instead of the Islamic market this year. Now, in terms of impact on the credit worthiness of these issuers, it's going to very much depend on the company, the government, or the bank itself. So some of the, for example, if I take the sovereigns in the GCC, some of them have more debt absorptive capacity than others. If you look at Bahrain and Oman, for example, they have less debt absorptive capacity if you compare them with a country like, I don't know, Saudi or Qatar. So there will be additional debt raised. That's I think that's a fair point, given the drop in the oil prices, given the economic correction. But we think that most of it will happen on the conventional space, and also we think that there could be some rating implication. And maybe to finish on a point, since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, we have taken more than 70 rating actions on banks in emerging markets. Most of them have been either in form of negative outlook or downgrade, and that's to reflect the potential negative impact this crisis would have on their asset quality, on their profitability. But if you look at the rating distribution, in some countries we didn't take any rating action. And we said that banks in these countries, for example, have a lot of leeway to absorb the negative impact of the current crisis before starting to hit their capital base. For example, if you look at the rated banks that we rate in the GCC, we did some simulation and we came to the conclusion that they can absorb a shock of $36 billion before they start to deplete their capital base.
Okay. And that's because financial institutions are coming into this crisis in a much better position as they were if compared against the global financial crisis. So I'll take one more question here, and I will pose this to both Dato Redza and Dr. Engku. And I'll ask Dato Redza first, question regarding VBI. What are the key success factors for Islamic banks to successfully implement VBI and other key principles? I think Dr. Engku mentioned VBI very impressively. I think the VBI is a very impressive model to implement, where it provides a framework for Islamic banks to showcase the value-based proposition and the true value proposition of Islamic finance. The question here is, what are the key success factors? What are the metrics, for example, that measures an Islamic bank's successful implementation of VBI? Dato Redza, would you like to take this first? And then
yeah, sure. I'll take it, and I'll do it quickly. First of all, I think the right foundations have been laid. There was what we call a COP, Community of Practitioners, that involves all Islamic bank CEOs that were involved in the VBI. So they discussed at the highest level on how to implement VBI. And my take on this is, if you want to do VBI, you must have dedicated people who are going to be looking at this. And the most important thing is the leader themselves, the CEO, must believe in this. They don't believe in this because they want to please Bank Negara or any authorities. They believe in this because they have this faith in Islamic finance that VBI is a good thing and I need to implement it. And it really comes from the top. And if the top guy doesn't do it, then we won't see VBI implemented. So, and another thing is also, VBI is never in the KPI of any of these CEOs. Why don't the board of the banks actually put VBI as something of a KPI, and even at the regulatory level, Bank Negara are looking at this as a form of a measure on the performance or productivity of a particular bank. With that type of push, I think we will see VBI through, because if we leave things as it is, I think it won't go very far. Thanks.
Prof. Engku, your views, please. Prof, your views, please.
Yeah, okay. I agree with Dr. Redza in the fact that VBI would require the first and foremost would be the people, the conviction of the people who are going to implement this, and especially the leadership. But if we remember when VBI was put on the table by the central bank, I think the last effort that they did before the change of leadership in the central bank was actually to develop the KPI and impact measurement, as well as balanced scorecard for the implementation of the VBI. So I think this is the next part. First, we need to have the people and leadership to actually bring this and champion this. And the next part is actually to see that there is metrics to measure and reward the banks when they manage to implement it properly. So basically, when we go for VBI, we cannot use the same KPI with what we have now, because the current framework, we only have profit, okay, as one bottom line. When we have triple bottom line, profit, people, and planet, so the KPI will be different. So if, let's say, the profit is reduced in terms of the P, the first P, but the social impact on the people is high, and the social impact on the environment, the environmental impact on the other P, the planet, is high. So the total scorecard, the balanced scorecard, will be the bank is still achieving its KPI. Okay, if this is put in place, then it will not be an issue for the Islamic Bank. If you don't have measures or value weight given to the other two P's, the planet and the people, and you only rely on the first P, then it will not work. Just like when we are looking at the moratorium now, if you just look at dollars and cents, the bank has loss, reduced profit or loss, 4.4 billion loss. This is what they are saying. But if you were to measure the social impact that this moratorium is having on the people, on their life, on their livelihood, and put some kind of units or aggregate value of that social impact, and that will be compensating the reduction in the profit in the dollars and cents, then you can see a more balanced scorecard for the Islamic Bank, which is taking into consideration not just the value of profit, but also the value of the other two P's, which is the people and the planet. So without this new measurement, new KPI, new balanced scorecard, it will be hard for the Islamic Bank management. Let's say the management, the leadership are all out for it. But if they don't have this, it will be difficult for them to convince their shareholders and stakeholders that we are still performing. Okay, so this is my point on this. So we need to have the full system in order to that is being incentivized for the people to implement.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Engku, and I'm very sure there are more questions that are coming through, but we have to end this session, and I like to take another 5 more minutes of the speakers. I like to get each speaker to take 1 minute to respond to the final concluding remark. If you are invited by a government of any country to advise on Islamic finance, what role it can play post-COVID-19, what would your advice be? Can I start with Prof. Engku within 1 minute, please?
A big question to be answered in a very short time. Okay, so what I can say is basically, I would say that basically Islamic finance has to have the balanced approach. I want to reiterate that, to have a balanced approach. It's not just about profit. You have to change that mindset. That's a basic thing. Because if you look at every time we discuss with the banks, they always come back to this equation, and we are not moving forward. Okay, so we have to change this mindset. It's not just about profit. Okay, and then we have to actually try to bridge the role of the normal Islamic finance with that of Islamic social finance and the other third sectors in the economy. You know, like bridging Islamic finance with the Wakaf institution, with the foundations, with Zakat institutions. And we have to see all these segments of Islamic economy working together in order to give the most impactful results to the public, inshallah.
Okay, thank you. Dato Redza, same question to you.
Yeah, okay. Basically, I think let's go back to this COVID-19 issue. Basically, COVID-19 was created by humans, sent by God. So I want to go back and refer to whether we should do more profitability or social impact. I think the answer lies in the Quran. And if you read Surah Ar-Ra'd, I quote here and I conclude here, Allah changes not the good condition of a people until they first change the conditions, and He will it back, nor have they protected the sites. And we are practicing Islamic finance, we better well do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dato. Dr. Damak, your views on this?
Can you hear me?
Yes, good.
Okay, excellent. So as you probably know, I cannot make any advice, otherwise I might have big problems by regulation, but I'll make an observation. I think if you look at the industry of Islamic finance, the principle exists, the social responsible instrument exists. So if there are used, it could make a real difference in the world.
And that's the Rushdi in New York.
As-Salamu Alaikum. Actually, the advice is what advice to give to a non-Muslim country about Islamic finance and to a Muslim country. So to a non-Muslim country, I think the benefits of zakat, qard al-hasan, waqf, endowments, these low-income people. And so these particular instruments are ripe and right to help them as bridge financing, as gap financing in the form of grants. So that's one thing. Has to be the congestion-induced problems. I mentioned of the 33 megacities from the Muslim countries, each has Islamic finance. We need to think about making smart villages and smart cities in the Muslim world. Islamic finance has to contribute by financing startups and by way of green SRIs.
Okay, thank you. I wish to thank all the panelists for their insightful views. I also wish to conclude this session by thanking the organizers and all participants for joining this session. Let's hope that we will weather this crisis and come out of it stronger and better. With that, thank you. I pass the floor back to the organizers.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Mr. Syed Alwi. Thank you for moderating this webinar, and also thank you to all the speakers for participating and also for your time. So before we end our session, to the participants, please fill in the e-evaluation form for us to improve in future events. So on behalf of the organizer, we would like to thank everyone, the speakers, and also the participants to participate in this session. Thank you so much. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.